Australia is often described as vast, ancient, and untamed. Its landscapes stretch from dense tropical rainforests to frozen alpine peaks, from endless desert plains to mist-covered mountain ridges. Millions of people travel through these environments every year believing that what they see is all that exists. But the wilderness has never promised full disclosure. For generations, stories have circulated about something large moving just beyond the tree line. Something upright. Something that does not behave like any known animal native to the continent. Most dismiss these stories as folklore, misidentification, or imagination shaped by isolation and fear. Yet when similar details surface across thousands of kilometers, the narrative begins to demand closer attention. These are not campfire myths passed casually between tourists. They are reports from hikers, farmers, rangers, rail workers, photographers, teachers, and long-haul drivers. Individuals accustomed to the outdoors. Individuals who understand the difference between wildlife and something that does not fit established patterns. What makes these encounters different is not simply size or shadow. It is behavior. Deliberate positioning. Coordinated movement. Structured vocalizations. The repeated choice to appear at boundaries, campsites, roads, fences, cabins, and then withdraw without chaos. Across Australia, witnesses describe the same unsettling elements: broad shoulders covered in dark coarse hair, arms extending lower than human proportions, steady forward-facing eyes reflecting faint light, and deep resonant sounds that vibrate through trees and open land alike. They describe perimeters being paced but not crossed. Structures being tested but not breached. It is not the image of a wild creature stumbling into civilization. It is the image of something that understands territory. Something that studies before acting. Something that allows itself to be seen, briefly, intentionally, and then disappears into terrain that should not conceal something so large. Skepticism is natural. It should be. Extraordinary claims require careful thought. But the consistency of these reports across diverse ecosystems challenges simple dismissal. Rainforest. Snowfields. Desert highways. Mangrove estuaries. Remote farmland. The patterns repeat. This documentary brings together 14 structured accounts from across the continent. Not to sensationalize. Not to exaggerate. But to examine recurring details that remain unexplained. Each witness stands by their experience. Each location remains geographically verifiable. Each report contains behavioral consistencies that are difficult to ignore. If even one of these accounts reflects an undocumented species, it would reshape our understanding of Australia's wilderness. If the pattern suggests something more adaptive and more aware than previously imagined, then the implications extend beyond biology. Because the question may not be whether something is out there. The question may be how long it has been observing us in return. I had camped in the Barrington Tops before, but that night felt different from the beginning. The wind had stopped completely, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. No insects. No distant birds. No movement in the trees. Just the faint crackling of the fire beside my boots. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I've spent most of my life hiking remote parts of Australia. I don't scare easily, especially not in the bush, but something about that silence felt deliberate, like I was no longer alone, like something had decided to watch me. The stars were unusually bright, casting pale silver light over the eucalyptus trunks, and the smoke from the fire rose straight into the sky without drifting. Even the air felt heavy in my lungs. I remember checking my watch, 11:47 p.m., when I heard the first knock. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to carry, a deep wooden crack echoing through the valley. Then another. And then silence again, thick and unnatural. I told myself it was just a falling branch. That happens often in dry forest. But these knocks were rhythmic, measured, intentional. 3 knocks spaced evenly apart. Then nothing. Then 3 more. almost like a signal carried through timber and darkness. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on immediately because I didn't want to announce my position. Instead, I listened. The fire popped softly while my heart beat harder than it should have. Then I heard slow movement in the leaf litter. Not scurrying like a wallaby. Not hopping. Heavy steps pressing into the ground with deliberate weight, the kind made by something large. Each step felt calculated, controlled, not clumsy. I finally switched on the flashlight and the beam cut through the darkness in a narrow white line. Trees. Shadows. Empty space. But the sound had stopped as soon as the light appeared, as if whatever made it understood what light meant. I stood slowly and stepped away from the firelight. That's when I smelled it, a thick, musky odor like wet animal fur mixed with soil. It wasn't rotting. It wasn't dead. It was alive and close. Close enough that I felt the hair on my arms rise. Close enough that it could see me clearly even if I couldn't see it. Another knock echoed from behind me this time, no more than 50 meters away. My throat tightened as I turned quickly, sweeping the beam across the tree-line. That's when I saw movement, a shape shifting between two trunks, too tall to be normal human height, too broad to dismiss as imagination. It stepped into partial moonlight for less than 2 seconds, but that was enough. It was covered in dark brown hair with massive shoulders and long arms hanging low near its knees. The face was shadowed, but the eyes reflected pale gold in the beam. Not like a kangaroo. Not like a deer. They were forward-facing and focused directly on me. It didn't charge. It didn't scream. It just stood there watching, studying me as if I were the animal in its territory. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. Predators don't need to rush. They assess. They calculate. And whatever this was, it was calculating. Then it made a sound I can't properly describe. Not a roar. Not a howl. More like a deep chest vibration that rolled through the trees. It wasn't aggressive. It was territorial, a warning, a statement that I did not belong there. I didn't wait for it to repeat. I backed toward the fire without breaking eye contact, and the moment I reached the light, it stepped backward into the trees. Completely silent. No crashing branches. No clumsy retreat. Just gone, like it had dissolved into the forest, though the smell lingered long after it disappeared. At sunrise, I found footprints about 30 meters from camp. They were enormous, longer than my boot by several inches, with clear toe impressions and a deep heel indentation. Too large for any known Australian animal. Too human to ignore. Too heavy to fake. And they led away into thick bushland where visibility ended after a few meters. I left the Barrington Tops that morning with more questions than answers. I've camped in storms. I've faced wild dogs. I've been lost before. But nothing has ever felt like being silently evaluated by something that understood me, something that chose not to attack even though it could have. And somehow, that restraint is what unsettles me the most. It was supposed to be a routine drive through a closed logging road near the Blue Mountains. I wasn't alone this time. My cousin Mark was with me, and we had spent the afternoon checking old survey markers left behind decades ago. The sun had already dipped behind the ridges when we decided to head back. The gravel road stretched long and empty ahead of us, framed by dense eucalyptus forest that seemed darker than usual. The air felt cooler than it should have for late summer. Mark joked that we should hurry before the bush people came out. Neither of us was laughing 20 minutes later. The headlights carved 2 narrow tunnels of light through the darkness as we drove slowly to avoid damaging the suspension. That's when we saw something standing directly in the center of the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree stump. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, tall and upright. I eased my foot off the accelerator, and the vehicle rolled closer. The shape did not shift. It did not react to the engine. It simply remained in place, as if it had been waiting. When we were about 40 meters away, the outline became clearer. It wasn't a stump. It wasn't a person either. It was too wide across the shoulders and far too tall to be any human I had ever seen. Mark whispered, "Do you see that?" I didn't answer because I couldn't take my eyes off it. The headlights fully illuminated the figure now. Dark fur covered its body, thick and uneven, catching the light in patches. It turned its head slowly toward us. The movement was controlled and deliberate. Not startled. Not confused. Just aware. Its arms hung low, longer than they should have, and the hands appeared large enough to wrap around a small tree trunk. I felt the inside of the car suddenly shrink, like the cabin had become too small for safety. The engine idled softly, but the forest beyond the beams remained completely silent. I honked the horn once, more out of instinct than strategy. The sound echoed across the trees. The figure did not flinch. Instead, it took a single step forward toward the vehicle. One heavy step that pressed into the gravel. We both heard it. Not imagined. Not guessed. Heard. The crunch of stones shifting under immense weight. Mark muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't focus on words. My body had already chosen fear before my mind caught up. The figure's eyes reflected a dull amber glow under the headlights. Not bright like a deer. Not scattered like a kangaroo. Focused and steady. Watching us with an intelligence that made my stomach twist. Then it did something unexpected. It tilted its head slightly to one side, almost studying us the way a person might observe an unfamiliar animal. That gesture unsettled me more than aggression would have. It wasn't acting wild. It wasn't reacting impulsively. It was analyzing. Without warning, it stepped off the road to the left in 3 long strides. Each movement was smooth and quiet for something so large. The trees swallowed it almost instantly. There was no chaotic crashing. No frantic escape. Just deliberate withdrawal into the bush. We sat there in silence for several seconds. Neither of us wanted to admit what we had just seen. Finally, I put the car in drive and moved forward to where it had stood. The gravel showed impressions, large, elongated footprints pressed deep into the surface. Too large for boots. Too defined to be random disturbances. We didn't follow it into the forest. Neither of us suggested it. We drove out without speaking for almost 10 kilometers. The usual night sounds never returned during that stretch of road. No insects. No distant animals. Just the hum of tires and our breathing. Back in town, we agreed not to exaggerate what happened. We stuck to the facts. A large, upright figure. Dark fur. Intelligent behavior. No aggression, but no fear either. Whatever stood on that logging road wasn't lost. It wasn't confused. It was there intentionally. And if it chose to stand in front of our vehicle that night, the real question isn't whether it exists. The real question is why it wanted to be seen. If these accounts intrigue you and you want to explore the unexplained depths of Australia's wilderness, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts below. Have you ever experienced something in the bush that you still can't explain? Your story might be closer to this mystery than you think. I never believed in unexplained creatures until I worked a seasonal contract near the Daintree rainforest in far north Queensland. The jungle there feels ancient, older than memory itself, thick with humidity and shadow even during the day. My job was simple: maintain a remote ecolodge trail system that tourists rarely used after dusk. Most nights were predictable. Heavy air. Distant insect hum. The occasional rustle of possums in the canopy. But one night in late October, the forest made a sound I had never heard before. It began as a low rumble somewhere beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was thunder rolling across the hills. The wet season was approaching, and storms were common. But the sky was clear. No clouds. No lightning. The sound didn't fade like thunder either. It rose. It deepened. It transformed into something else, something vocal. The scream that followed didn't resemble any animal I knew. I grew up in rural Queensland. I know the cry of dingoes. I know the unsettling shriek of foxes. I even know how terrifying a cassowary can sound in the dark. This was none of those. It was layered. Almost guttural at the base, but with a piercing edge that cut through the trees and vibrated in my chest. The sound echoed once more, closer this time. Not distant. Not faint. Close enough that I could feel it in the wooden deck beneath my boots. The jungle responded instantly. Insects stopped mid-chorus. Birds that had been settling for the night burst upward in sudden movement. Then everything fell silent. I grabbed my radio instinctively, though I wasn't sure what I would say. Large unidentified scream doesn't sound convincing over a channel. I stepped down from the deck and shone my flashlight toward the outer edge of the clearing. The beam barely pierced the dense vegetation. Vines, thick trunks, layered undergrowth. The rainforest swallowed light whole. Another sound came then, not a scream, but heavy movement. Branches shifting under weight. Leaves brushing against something tall. Whatever it wasn't small. It wasn't moving like a pig or a deer. The rhythm of its steps suggested upright motion, steady and controlled. Then I saw it. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough. A tall silhouette shifted between two strangler figs about 30 meters from the lodge. Broad shoulders. A thick outline against the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. It paused as if listening. As if gauging whether I had seen it. The smell reached me seconds later, damp fur mixed with earth and something metallic underneath. Not decay. Not rot. Something raw and living. The same oppressive stillness settled over the clearing, pressing against my ears. I felt watched in a way that was impossible to describe without sounding dramatic. It wasn't just observation. It felt evaluative. The figure moved again, stepping slightly into a gap where pale moonlight traced its form. Dark hair covered its torso and arms. The head sat lower than a human's would in proportion to the shoulders, giving it a dense, powerful shape. Its eyes caught the faint reflection of my flashlight beam. They did not scatter. They did not blink rapidly like an animal startled by light. They held steady, fixed directly on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Every instinct told me to retreat inside the lodge, but something rooted me in place. Then it let out another vocalization, lower this time. Not as piercing. More resonant. A warning rather than a display. It felt like the rainforest itself amplified the sound. The trees seemed to carry it deeper into the jungle. Without haste, the figure turned and stepped sideways into thicker foliage. No dramatic crash. No frantic escape. Just controlled disappearance. The vegetation closed behind it as if nothing had passed through. The insects did not resume immediately. The jungle remained silent for several minutes after it left. I stood there long enough for my hands to begin shaking from delayed adrenaline. When I finally returned to the lodge and locked the doors, I realized I had been holding my breath. The next morning, I found impressions in the soft mud near the outer perimeter of the clearing. Large. Deep. Not perfectly shaped like a human footprint, but unmistakably bipedal. Too large to dismiss. Too defined to ignore. I finished that contract 2 weeks later. I didn't quit out of fear. I left because I understood something fundamental that night. The rainforest is not empty. It is not passive. And whatever screamed from the Daintree that evening was not lost or wandering. It was at home. Mount Warning has always carried stories older than the towns that surround it. The mountain rises sharply from the landscape in northern New South Wales, wrapped in mist most mornings and shadow long before sunset. A small crew of independent prospectors had been working a remote section near its base when the encounters began. They weren't tourists. They weren't thrill-seekers. They were practical men focused on equipment, terrain, and profit. None of them had time for myths. The first sign was subtle: tools moved from where they had been left the night before. Nothing dramatic. A shovel placed against a tree would be found laid flat in the dirt. A fuel can shifted several meters away. At first, they blamed each other. Accusations turned into brief arguments. But the pattern continued, even when they deliberately marked positions before leaving for the night. Then the rocks started coming. Not thrown directly at them, but landing close enough to be intentional. A heavy stone would strike the ground 10 meters from camp. Then another from a different direction. The impacts were forceful, too strong to be random slides from higher ground. The terrain around them was stable. There was no loose cliff above their position. One of the miners, an older man named Russell, insisted they were being warned. The others dismissed it as paranoia until one evening when all four of them were present to witness it. A rock, larger than a football, sailed from the tree line and landed between two equipment crates. They all saw the arc. They all heard the force of the impact. They advanced cautiously toward the forest edge together, expecting to confront trespassers. What they found instead was silence. No retreating footsteps. No broken branches. Just dense bushland thick enough to hide anything large without revealing it. That night, they kept a larger fire burning. The air felt tight around the camp, like pressure before a storm. Around midnight, they heard the first knock echo through the trees, deep and resonant, like wood struck against wood. Then another, closer. Then a third from the opposite direction. The knocks were not random. They surrounded the camp. One of the younger miners shone a spotlight into the darkness and caught movement between two trunks uphill from their position. The beam traced the outline of something tall. Broad across the chest. Standing upright without shifting. For several seconds, it did not move. Russell later described the figure as solid, not shadow. Dark hair covered its body, thick and uneven. The arms hung low, and the hands appeared unusually large, partially curled. Its posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if observing rather than confronting. The spotlight caught its eyes briefly. They reflected a muted yellow glow, steady and forward-facing. Not scattered. Not panicked. Intelligent. A second shape appeared slightly behind it, not as clearly visible, but distinct enough to confirm they were not dealing with a single presence. None of the men shouted. None of them fired a warning shot, though at least one was armed. Something about the stillness of the figures prevented escalation. The air itself seemed suspended, waiting for someone to make a mistake. Then the lead figure took one slow step backward into shadow. The second shape followed. Within seconds, both had blended seamlessly into the forest. There was no frantic crash of retreating bodies. No reckless movement. Just controlled withdrawal. The miners did not sleep that night. They remained awake until sunrise, weapons close, eyes scanning the tree line. At first light, they inspected the perimeter and found deep impressions in the soft soil near the uphill slope. The prints were elongated, with visible toe shapes pressed clearly into damp earth. They abandoned the site within a week. Officially, they cited equipment damage and poor yield. Unofficially, they agreed on one thing: whatever stood above their camp that night did not act like wildlife. It acted with purpose. And Mount Warning still stands, quiet and mist-covered, keeping whatever secrets it chooses not to surrender. Cape York is not forgiving land. The heat presses against your skin, the mangroves swallow sound, and the tides shift without warning. I met Aaron Fletcher years after his encounter, but he still spoke about it in a measured tone, as if carefully selecting each word to avoid sounding dramatic. He had been fishing alone along a remote estuary where the river meets the sea. No houses. No cell signal. Just tidal flats, thick bush, and miles of isolation. He had anchored his small aluminum boat near the muddy bank and set 2 lines into the water. The sun was already lowering, painting the sky in faded orange. The mangroves behind him were dense and tangled, forming a natural wall. He remembers thinking how still everything felt. No wind moving the leaves. No bird calls. Just the soft lap of water against the hull. That stillness broke with a heavy splash somewhere upriver. At first, he assumed it was a crocodile entering the water. Crocs are common there, and he had seen plenty over the years. But the splash wasn't followed by the ripple pattern crocodiles make when they glide. Instead, he heard something wading, deliberate movement through shallow mud. Aaron turned slowly, scanning the mangrove edge. What stepped out onto the muddy bank was not a crocodile. It stood upright. At first, his brain refused to process the proportions. It was taller than any man he had known, easily over 7 feet, with broad shoulders and long arms hanging low near its thighs. Dark, matted hair covered most of its body, clinging damply as if it had just emerged from thick vegetation. Its legs were powerful, planted firmly into the mud without hesitation. It did not stumble. It did not crouch. It stood there, facing the river. Aaron froze, afraid even to shift his weight in the boat. The figure turned its head slowly toward him, and he saw the face partially illuminated by the fading sunlight. The features were heavy-boned, the brow pronounced, the eyes set forward and steady. There was no confusion in its gaze. No startled reaction. The smell reached him across the water, musky, earthy, with a sharp edge beneath it that he couldn't identify. It was the smell of something that belonged in the wild but not in any category he recognized. For several long seconds, neither moved. Then the figure stepped forward into the shallow water. The mud did not slow it down. The water parted around its legs as it waded several steps, testing depth with slow precision. Aaron's heart pounded so loudly he was certain it could hear it. He considered starting the engine, but the sudden noise might provoke it. Instead, he watched. The creature bent slightly, placing one massive hand into the water as if feeling the current. Its fingers were long, thicker than a man's wrist. It seemed curious rather than aggressive. Studying. Assessing. Then it made a low vocal sound, deep and resonant, almost like a hum vibrating through its chest. The sound carried across the estuary and seemed to sink into the mangroves behind it. Not a threat. Not a roar. A declaration of presence. After that, it straightened, stepped backward out of the water, and turned toward the dense brush. Each stride was smooth and powerful. Within seconds, it disappeared into the mangrove wall without breaking branches or crashing through foliage. The silence returned instantly. Aaron waited nearly 10 minutes before daring to start the engine. When he finally approached the bank cautiously, he saw deep impressions in the mud where it had stood. Large, elongated prints with visible toe marks pressed deeply into the wet ground. No sign of drag. No tail mark. No confusion in the stride pattern. He never returned to that estuary. Years later, he still insists the encounter was not an illusion of light or fear. He says the most unsettling part was not the size. Not the strength. It was the awareness in its eyes. The way it looked at him not as prey, but as another presence sharing the same territory. Cape York remains vast and largely unexplored in many sections. The tides erase tracks quickly. The mangroves hide movement efficiently. And if something large chooses to step out only when it wants to be seen, there may be far more in those wetlands than anyone is prepared to admit. The Grampians National Park in Victoria attracts hikers year-round, but large sections of it remain rugged and rarely explored beyond marked trails. Two experienced hikers, Liam Carter and his partner Elise, decided to take a less-traveled route along a ridge system known for its panoramic views. They were not reckless adventurers. Both had years of bushwalking experience and carried proper navigation equipment. What they encountered was not a simple case of getting lost. The first sign was the feeling of being followed. It began subtly, with small disturbances in the bush behind them. A branch snapping several seconds after they passed a narrow path. Loose stones shifting down the slope. Each time they stopped to listen, the forest would freeze in silence. When they resumed walking, the sounds would eventually return. Elise suggested it might be a kangaroo pacing them uphill. Liam considered the possibility, but the rhythm didn't match. Kangaroos move in bursts. This was steady. Measured. Maintaining distance. They reached a rocky clearing near the ridge crest around late afternoon. The wind up there usually carries sound clearly, but that day it seemed muted. Even their own footsteps felt absorbed by the terrain. They set down their packs and scanned the valley below. That's when Elise noticed movement across the clearing near a cluster of tall shrubs. At first, it looked like shadow shifting. But the sun was still high enough to cast defined lines. The shape stepped forward slowly, emerging from behind the vegetation. Upright. Massive. Covered in dark brown hair that caught light unevenly across its torso. Liam described the moment later as watching something prehistoric step into the present. The figure did not crouch or attempt to conceal itself once visible. It stood fully upright, easily taller than any human they had seen. Broad chest. Thick neck. Arms hanging low, hands nearly reaching mid-thigh. Its posture was relaxed but balanced, like something fully aware of its physical advantage. They did not scream. They did not run. They froze. The creature's head turned slightly toward them. Its eyes locked on their position without hesitation. There was no confusion. No startled reaction. It had known they were there long before they saw it. A low exhale carried across the clearing. Not a roar. Not a growl. More like controlled breath expelled through large lungs. The sound carried weight, vibrating faintly against the rock surface. Liam slowly reached for his camera strapped to his chest, but before he could lift it fully, the figure shifted its stance. One foot pressed into the soil, leaving a visible indentation even from their distance. Then, with deliberate calm, it stepped backward into the shrubs. It did not turn its back fully. It maintained partial visual contact as it withdrew. Within seconds, it was gone. No dramatic crashing through brush. No frantic retreat down the slope. Just silent disappearance into terrain that looked too dense to allow smooth passage. The silence afterward felt heavier than the encounter itself. The wind returned gradually. Distant bird calls resumed. The normal sounds of the Grampians crept back into place, as if the forest had been paused and then unpaused. They approached the area cautiously once several minutes had passed. The ground near the shrubs showed clear depressions. Large footprints pressed deeply into soil mixed with rock fragments. Too large for boots. Too evenly spaced for random disturbance. Neither of them spoke much during the hike back down. Later, reviewing the brief partial image Liam managed to capture before lowering the camera, they found nothing clear enough to prove what they had seen. A blurred outline. A suggestion of mass. Nothing definitive. But both agreed on one detail that disturbed them the most. It wasn't surprised to see them. It was escorting them. And once they reached the ridge, it made sure they knew it was there. The property sat 20 kilometers outside Gympie, surrounded by rolling paddocks and thick patches of bushland that bordered the rear fencing. The Turner family had lived there for nearly 12 years without incident. Cattle moved calmly through the fields, dogs patrolled the perimeter, and nights were usually filled with the predictable sounds of rural Australia. That changed during the late winter of 2019. The first disturbance was the livestock. Several cattle were found clustered tightly against the far fence line one morning, visibly agitated. No signs of attack. No broken fencing. Just deep impressions in the mud beyond the property boundary that suggested something heavy had been pacing along the outside edge. The prints were elongated and unusually wide. Too large for a human. Too narrow for any known livestock. Mr. Turner initially suspected trespassers attempting to scout the land. He walked the perimeter with his rifle that evening but found nothing unusual. The dogs, however, behaved differently. They refused to approach the rear fence after sunset. Instead of barking aggressively, they whimpered and stayed close to the house. 3 nights later, around 2:30 a.m., Mrs. Turner woke to the sound of heavy movement near the shed. Not the light shuffle of a kangaroo brushing against metal. This was weight pressing into gravel. Deliberate, slow footsteps. She nudged her husband awake, and they both listened in the darkness. A shadow passed across the outside floodlight. It moved upright. Mr. Turner stepped onto the porch with a spotlight in hand, scanning the yard cautiously. The beam swept across the shed, the tractor, the water tank. Then it caught something at the fence line near the bush. For several seconds, the light rested on a tall figure standing partially obscured by a eucalyptus trunk. Dark hair covered its body. Broad shoulders. Long arms hanging low at its sides. It stood completely still under the beam, neither startled nor aggressive. The height alone exceeded any human known in the region. Mr. Turner shouted instinctively, demanding whoever it was to identify themselves. The figure did not respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, observing him with what he later described as calculated stillness. The eyes reflected faintly under the spotlight, not wide or panicked, but focused. Then came a deep, low vocal sound. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the yard with a resonant vibration. The dogs inside the house retreated further, whining softly. The cattle in the field shifted again, pressing tightly together. The figure took one slow step backward, maintaining eye contact. Another step. Then it turned partially, revealing the width of its back and the density of its build. With controlled movement, it entered the bush without breaking into a run. No crashing branches. No frantic escape. Just steady disappearance into the darkness. The Turners did not sleep for the remainder of the night. At first light, Mr. Turner inspected the fence line. Deep footprints pressed into damp soil just beyond the boundary. Clear toe impressions. Long stride distance between steps. No sign of mechanical tampering. No indication of prank or fabrication. Over the next 2 weeks, similar pacing patterns appeared along different sections of the property. Always outside the fence. Always just beyond the edge of light. It never crossed onto the farm. It never attacked livestock. It simply walked the perimeter. As if conducting its own inspection. Eventually, the disturbances stopped as suddenly as they began. The cattle calmed. The dogs resumed normal patrol behavior. The prints faded under rain and wind. But the Turners remained certain of one thing. Whatever stood at their fence that night was not wandering aimlessly. It knew exactly where the boundary was. And it chose not to cross it. Kosciuszko National Park is vast, cold, and deceptive in its silence. During winter months, certain patrol routes are rarely used except by rangers monitoring remote weather stations and fire access roads. In July of 2021, Senior Ranger Matthew Doyle was assigned a night patrol after reports of unusual disturbances near a restricted section of alpine forest. There had been no confirmed sightings of illegal campers, but equipment had been displaced and tracks had been reported in snow that did not match known wildlife patterns. The temperature had dropped well below freezing by the time Matthew reached the High Ridge access road. Snow reflected faint moonlight, turning the landscape pale and almost artificial in appearance. The engine of his vehicle sounded unnaturally loud in the open silence. When he stepped out to inspect a locked gate near the ridge trailhead, the stillness felt absolute, as if even the wind had paused. He noticed the first track beside the road just meters from his vehicle. It was not kangaroo. Not wombat. Not deer. It was elongated, pressed deeply into snow, with distinct toe impressions at the front and a defined heel at the back. The stride distance between prints suggested long, powerful steps. They crossed the road at an angle and disappeared into a line of snow-covered trees. Matthew followed them cautiously for several meters, keeping his radio clipped close and his flashlight steady. The snow muffled his own movement, but he became aware of something else, a secondary set of compressions further uphill, parallel to his path. Not identical, but similar in size. It suggested more than one presence had moved through that area. Then came the sound. A deep, resonant call rolled through the trees, echoing across the snow-covered slope. It was not a dingo howl. It was not wind moving through branches. It was layered and sustained, vibrating in a way that felt almost structural, as if it pressed against the cold air itself. The call was followed by silence so complete that Matthew could hear his own breath condensing. He turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight beam across the tree-line. That was when he saw movement above him on the incline. A tall figure stepped from behind a snow-laden pine, fully upright, its dark outline contrasting sharply against the pale ground. Thick hair covered its body, darker than the surrounding landscape, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. It did not rush. It did not retreat. It stood balanced on the slope as if gravity had less authority over it than over him. The shoulders were broad, the chest dense and powerful. Long arms hung low, hands partially curled, fingers appearing thick even from a distance. The head tilted slightly as it observed him. Matthew described the eyes as steady rather than glowing, simply reflective, forward-facing, and focused. There was no erratic behavior. No aggression. Just assessment. The creature shifted its weight once, pressing its foot deeper into snow, leaving a clearer imprint that confirmed its immense size. A second call echoed from further downhill, slightly behind Matthew's position. The sound was lower in pitch, shorter in duration. A response. The figure on the slope did not look away from him, but its posture subtly adjusted, suggesting coordination rather than randomness. The ranger felt a controlled fear, the kind that sharpens rather than paralyzes. He understood he was outnumbered. The snow around him made retreat slow and vulnerable. He slowly stepped backward toward his vehicle without turning his back fully. The figure on the slope took one deliberate step sideways, maintaining distance but keeping him within view. It did not advance beyond that. It did not charge. It simply tracked his movement visually. Once Matthew reached the vehicle and opened the door, the creature shifted again, this time stepping backward into the trees. Its dark form blended quickly into shadow between trunks. The snow did not reveal frantic escape lines. Just steady, measured prints leading away uphill. He remained inside the vehicle for several minutes before driving down the access road. In his official report, he documented unidentified large bipedal tracks and unexplained vocalizations. Privately, he admitted the most unsettling detail was not the size or the calls. It was the coordination. The second voice from downhill. And the certainty that the figure above him was never alone. Arnhem Land is not a place people wander into casually. Vast stretches remain isolated, culturally significant, and environmentally untouched. In 2017, a supply driver named Colin Fraser was transporting equipment between two remote communities along a narrow dirt track that cut through scrubland and sparse woodland. The journey was long, and most of it passed without incident. But just before dusk, something stepped onto the road that did not belong there. Colin had slowed the truck due to a rough patch in the terrain when he noticed movement ahead in the fading light. At first, he assumed it was a large feral camel or perhaps a stray horse. The shape stood still in the center of the road, silhouetted against the orange horizon. As he approached within 50 meters, the proportions began to shift from what his brain expected. It was upright. Not rearing. Not mid-motion. Standing. He eased off the accelerator completely, letting the truck roll forward slowly. The figure remained motionless until the headlights fully illuminated it. Dark, thick hair covered its body from shoulders to calves. The chest was broad and heavy. The arms hung unusually low, with hands large enough to appear oversized even from inside the cab. The height alone forced Colin to reconsider what he was seeing. It exceeded any man he had known by a clear margin. The legs were powerful and planted firmly, feet spread slightly apart in a stable stance. It did not appear startled by the engine or the glare of the headlights. It turned its head deliberately toward the truck. The movement was controlled and slow, not reactive. The face was partially shadowed, but the eyes reflected a muted amber glow. Forward-facing. Focused. Calm. Colin felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with heat or exhaustion. He considered sounding the horn but hesitated. The stillness of the figure suggested it was not confused or lost. It was positioned intentionally. Then it stepped forward. One heavy step closer to the truck, gravel shifting under its weight. The sound carried through the metal frame of the vehicle. Not imagined. Not subtle. A clear compression of stone beneath something massive. Colin locked the doors instinctively. The figure did not rush the truck. Instead, it walked slowly across the road, passing directly through the beams of the headlights. For a moment, its full outline was visible: thick neck, sloping shoulders, dense musculature beneath dark fur. The proportions were not human. The gait, though upright, was smoother and more grounded. As it reached the opposite side of the road, it paused and looked back at him. That glance lasted only seconds, but Colin described it as deliberate. Not curiosity. Not fear. A measured evaluation. As if confirming his reaction. Then it stepped into the scrubland. There was no dramatic crash. No chaotic movement. The vegetation parted slightly and then settled. The road returned to emptiness as if nothing had occupied it moments before. Colin remained stationary for nearly a minute before driving forward to where it had stood. The dirt surface showed deep impressions, elongated and pressed firmly into the ground. Clear toe outlines visible even in fading light. No signs of vehicle tracks overlapping them. He completed the delivery in silence and reported the encounter informally to a local contact rather than through official channels. He knew how it would sound. But he insisted on one detail consistently: the figure was not wandering aimlessly. It had positioned itself in the center of the road. It had waited. And it had moved only after making sure it had been seen. The Otway Ranges in Victoria are dense, damp, and layered with thick temperate rainforest that absorbs both light and sound. In early spring of 2015, a secondary school organized a supervised camping trip in a permitted section near a forest clearing used regularly for educational programs. There were 2 teachers, 1 outdoor instructor, and 14 students aged between 15 and 16. What occurred on the second night was witnessed by more than one person. The first sign came shortly after 11 p.m., when several students reported hearing heavy movement beyond the perimeter of the campsite. The teachers initially assumed it was a large kangaroo or possibly a deer. The Otways are home to plenty of wildlife, and night sounds are common in that region. However, the movement did not retreat when lights were turned on. It circled. The footsteps were not erratic. They were steady. Measured. Slowly pacing the outer edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the lantern light. The outdoor instructor stepped away from the tents with a high-powered flashlight to assess the disturbance. As he swept the beam across the tree line, he caught a brief glimpse of something tall standing between 2 mountain ash trees. At first, he thought it was a trick of shadow and trunk alignment. Then the shape shifted. It stepped forward slightly into the outer edge of the clearing. The students nearest the instructor saw it too. A tall, broad-shouldered figure covered in dark hair, standing fully upright. The arms extended unusually low, the hands large and thick even at that distance. The chest appeared deep and powerful, rising slowly with controlled breathing. No one screamed. The shock was too heavy for immediate reaction. The creature did not charge the campsite. It did not vocalize aggressively. Instead, it stood watching the group with what several students later described as calm awareness. Its head turned slowly from one side to the other, as if counting or assessing the number of people present. Then came a low sound from the forest behind it. Not loud. Not sharp. A deep, resonant tone that carried through the trees. The figure in the clearing did not look startled by the sound. It did not shift abruptly. It simply adjusted its stance slightly, weight moving from one leg to the other, maintaining visual contact with the humans in the clearing. The instructor instructed everyone to remain still and avoid sudden movements. He kept the flashlight steady on the figure. In the beam, the fur appeared coarse and uneven, darker around the shoulders and lighter along the torso. The face was partially obscured, but the eyes reflected faintly, forward-facing and focused. After nearly 20 seconds of silent observation, the figure stepped backward. One deliberate step. Then another. It did not turn fully away. It maintained partial eye contact as it retreated into the forest. The vegetation absorbed its form gradually until only darkness remained between the trees. The circling footsteps ceased immediately after its disappearance. No crashing retreat. No panicked scattering of wildlife. The forest returned to stillness in a way that felt unnatural, as though a presence had lifted. The teachers moved the students into a tighter group formation and kept lanterns burning through the night. No further disturbances occurred. At sunrise, the instructor inspected the perimeter and found multiple large footprints pressed into soft soil near the edge of the clearing. Elongated. Deep. Clearly bipedal. More than one set. The official report filed afterward described unidentified wildlife disturbance. No photographs were clear enough to confirm anything definitive. But several students, now adults, still recount the same detail consistently. It was not confused. It was not curious in a harmless way. It was observing a group dynamic. And once it was satisfied, it withdrew. Western Tasmania holds some of the most isolated terrain in Australia. Thick temperate rainforest, steep valleys, and rivers that cut deep through untouched land. In 2012, a wildlife photographer named Graham Hollis rented a remote research cabin for a month-long documentation project focused on nocturnal species. The cabin sat nearly 20 kilometers from the nearest maintained road. There was no electricity beyond a small generator and no consistent communication signal. The first week passed quietly. Too quietly. Graham later said the silence in that region was different from mainland forest silence. It felt denser. Absorbing. Almost watchful. On the 8th night, just after midnight, he heard a knock against the outer wall of the cabin. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a branch brushing sighting. It was deliberate contact. 3 solid impacts spaced evenly apart. He remained still inside, listening. Several minutes passed before a second set of knocks came from the opposite side of the structure. The sound vibrated through the timber frame. Whatever was outside had circled the cabin. Graham retrieved his camera and stepped cautiously toward the small window facing the tree line. The moonlight provided faint illumination across the clearing surrounding the cabin. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then a shadow shifted between 2 trees near the edge of visibility. It stepped forward. The figure stood upright, clearly visible against the lighter bark of the surrounding trunks. Dark hair covered its body from shoulders to calves. The chest was wide and powerful, and the arms extended lower than human proportions would allow. It stood balanced and still, not crouched, not partially hidden. He lifted the camera slowly, adjusting focus. Before he could capture a clear frame, a second shape appeared behind the first, partially obscured by foliage but unmistakably similar in height and mass. They were positioned deliberately, one closer to the clearing, one deeper in shadow. The nearer figure turned its head toward the cabin window. The eyes reflected faint light. Not wide. Not startled. Aware. Graham felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. The presence outside was not behaving like curious wildlife. It was evaluating the structure itself. Then came a low, resonant vocalization from further to the left of the cabin. A third source. The tone was deeper and shorter, almost communicative. The figure nearest the clearing did not move immediately. Instead, it shifted its weight slightly, as if responding silently. The knocks resumed, this time from the rear wall of the cabin. Graham remained inside, refusing to step outside in darkness. The figures did not attempt to breach the door. They did not attack the structure. They circled. Slowly. Methodically. Maintaining distance but making their presence undeniable. After nearly 20 minutes, the activity ceased. The clearing fell silent once more. Graham did not sleep. At dawn, he stepped outside to inspect the perimeter. The damp soil near the rear wall of the cabin showed clear impressions, large, elongated footprints pressed deeply into earth softened by overnight moisture. Multiple sets. Varying stride lengths but similar in shape. The spacing between them suggested coordination rather than random wandering. He ended the project early and returned to town before completing the planned month. Officially, he cited equipment malfunction and weather concerns. Privately, he admitted that what unsettled him most was not the size of the figures or the knocking. It was the pattern. They approached from multiple directions. They communicated. They tested the structure without attempting forced entry. And they left only after confirming something about the occupant inside. Western Tasmania remains largely unchanged since that night. The cabin still stands. And no official explanation was ever offered for the coordinated presence that circled it in silence. In the remote interior of Western Australia, long freight trains move through hundreds of kilometers of open scrubland and sparse woodland with few interruptions. In 2018, a rail maintenance crew was assigned to inspect a section of track near a rarely used service corridor between two mining regions. The area was isolated, flat in some stretches, broken by patches of tall brush and scattered gum trees. There were 3 men on the team, all experienced workers accustomed to harsh and lonely terrain. The first irregularity was discovered just before sunset. Deep impressions crossed the gravel bed beside the tracks. At first glance, they appeared to be large boot prints, but the spacing was wrong. The stride length was unusually long, and the depth of the impression suggested tremendous weight. No vehicle tracks accompanied them. No signs of machinery interference. One of the workers joked about oversized pranksters wandering the outback. The others did not laugh. As dusk settled, the crew decided to finish the inspection early and return to their vehicle. That was when they heard the first metallic vibration. Not the rumble of an approaching train, but a faint tremor traveling through the rail itself, as if something heavy had stepped directly onto the steel. They turned toward the sound. About 100 meters down the line, a tall figure stood directly on the tracks. It was upright. Still. Framed against the fading sky. The proportions were immediately unsettling. Broad shoulders. Thick torso. Long arms hanging low near the upper thighs. Dark hair covered most of its body, absorbing the last light of day. It stood with one foot slightly forward, balanced and stable on the rail bed. None of the men spoke for several seconds. One of them raised a flashlight, but the beam was weak against the growing darkness. The figure shifted its head slightly toward them, acknowledging their presence without any sign of alarm. The stance was relaxed but controlled, as if the tracks themselves were no obstacle. Then it stepped forward along the rail line. Each footfall produced a faint metallic vibration that carried through the steel. The sound was distinct and rhythmic. Not hurried. Not aggressive. Simply deliberate. The crew instinctively backed toward their truck. The figure did not accelerate. It maintained distance, walking parallel to their retreat, keeping them within visual range. As it moved closer to a cluster of low brush near the side of the corridor, it paused and turned its head fully toward them. In the dim light, the eyes reflected faintly, steady, forward-facing, and fixed. Then, from the brush beyond the tracks, a second movement occurred. Another shape. Not as clearly visible, but equally tall. Positioned slightly behind the first. The realization that there was more than one presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. This was not a lone wanderer crossing by accident. The positioning suggested coordination. The lead figure stepped off the rail bed into the brush without breaking stride. The second shape followed, both disappearing smoothly into vegetation that did not seem capable of concealing something so large. The metallic vibration ceased immediately. The crew did not pursue. They returned to the truck and drove without further inspection. The next morning, in daylight, they revisited the section briefly. Large elongated prints remained pressed into gravel near the track. The steel showed faint scuff marks where heavy weight had shifted on the surface. No official wildlife explanation was provided. Privately, the crew agreed on one unsettling detail. The figure had chosen the tracks intentionally. An open corridor. A straight line of sight. A controlled space. And it had positioned itself where it could not be ignored. The Nullarbor Plain stretches across southern Australia in a way that feels endless. Long, straight highways cut through flat terrain where visibility extends for kilometers in every direction. In 2016, a couple driving from South Australia toward Western Australia decided to make the overnight crossing in one continuous trip. Traffic was sparse. The sky was clear. The road seemed infinite. Around 2:15 a.m., fatigue began to settle in. The driver, Claire, kept the speed steady while her partner, Ryan, scanned the dark edges of the highway for wandering wildlife. Kangaroos are common in that region at night, and collisions can be dangerous. That's why the shape ahead caught Ryan's attention almost immediately. Something was standing on the far shoulder of the road. Not moving. Not grazing. Standing. As they approached within 200 meters, the headlights gradually illuminated the outline. It was tall, taller than any human expected to be walking alone in that region. The proportions were wrong for a hitchhiker. The shoulders were too broad. The arms hung too low. Claire eased her foot off the accelerator. The figure stepped forward onto the edge of the asphalt. Not rushing. Not stumbling. Deliberate. It stood partially in the beam of the headlights, fully upright, covered in dark coarse hair that contrasted sharply against the pale desert ground. The chest appeared thick and solid, rising slowly with controlled breath. The legs were powerful, planted firmly as if rooted. Ryan whispered that it couldn't be real. The figure turned its head slowly toward the vehicle. The eyes reflected faint amber under the headlights. Forward-facing. Focused. Calm. Claire felt an immediate surge of fear, but something about the creature's posture stopped her from accelerating wildly. It did not appear predatory in that moment. It appeared observant. Then it began walking parallel to the road. Not toward the vehicle. Not away from it. Alongside it. Its stride was long and smooth, keeping pace for several seconds as the car rolled forward at reduced speed. The desert was silent except for the hum of the engine and the faint crunch of gravel under its feet when it stepped near the shoulder. After nearly 20 meters of parallel movement, it stopped. It turned its body slightly, positioning itself at an angle that allowed full visibility of the vehicle interior. The gesture felt intentional, as though confirming who or what was inside. Then, without any sudden movement, it stepped backward off the asphalt and into the open scrubland. There were no trees to conceal it, yet within moments its dark form blended with the terrain under low light. Claire did not stop the car. They drove for nearly an hour before speaking clearly about what they had seen. Both described the same details independently: upright posture, immense height, thick hair, deliberate pacing, direct eye contact. The following day, they checked the front of the vehicle expecting some mark or debris, convinced they must have misjudged distance. There was nothing. What unsettled them most was not the size or the isolation. It was the choice of location. An open highway. A flat landscape with no cover. A place where it would be impossible not to be seen. And yet, it stood there calmly, fully exposed, as if visibility itself was part of the message. By the time researchers began comparing reports from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory, one detail became impossible to ignore. The locations varied dramatically: rainforest, alpine snow, desert highway, mangrove estuary, rural farmland, remote rail corridors, yet the behavioral patterns described by witnesses showed striking similarities. These were not chaotic encounters. They followed structure. Across the country, the figures were described as upright, broad-shouldered, covered in dark coarse hair, with arms that extended lower than normal human proportions. Height estimates were consistent, ranging between 7 and 8 feet. The eyes were forward-facing and steady. The posture was balanced and controlled. There was no clumsy stumbling, no frantic panic typical of wildlife surprised by humans. More importantly, the creatures were rarely alone. In Tasmania, coordinated knocks circled a cabin. In Kosciuszko, dual vocalizations echoed across snow. In Mount Warning, 2 figures were seen positioned strategically above a mining camp. In the Otways, a low call came from behind the visible individual in the clearing. Again and again, witnesses described multiple presences operating in coordination. The pacing behavior was equally consistent. Perimeters were walked but not crossed. Campsites were circled but not breached. Roads were blocked temporarily but not aggressively. Fences were respected. Boundaries were acknowledged. It was as if an invisible territorial line existed that both sides understood without spoken agreement. The vocalizations also followed a pattern. Deep resonant tones. Layered calls. Rhythmic wood knocks. Not random noise. Structured sound used intentionally, often preceding visual contact or coordinating movement between multiple individuals. Then there was the eye contact. Witnesses from entirely different regions, who had never communicated with one another, described the same unsettling detail: the gaze felt evaluative. Not animal curiosity. Not blind aggression. Something closer to assessment. Observation with purpose. And in nearly every case, once the message had been delivered, once visibility had been confirmed, the figure withdrew calmly. No chaotic retreat. No dramatic chase. Just smooth disappearance into terrain that seemed insufficient to conceal something so large. The terrain diversity is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Rainforest. Alpine snowfields. Arid plains. Mangroves. Mountain ridges. If these accounts are accurate, whatever is being described is not confined to a single ecosystem. It adapts. It navigates. It understands different landscapes across an entire continent. Skeptics argue misidentification, stress, or environmental illusion. Yet the consistency of posture, coordination, territorial restraint, and controlled movement across thousands of kilometers challenges simple dismissal. Hallucinations do not synchronize behavioral traits across regions. Random wildlife encounters do not display structured perimeter control. What stands out most is what did not happen. There were no confirmed attacks in these accounts. No reckless charges. No attempts to force entry. The presence was made known, clearly and unmistakably, but escalation was avoided. Almost as if the objective was awareness rather than confrontation. If these sightings represent a real, undocumented species, it demonstrates intelligence, communication, and social structure beyond what most people are prepared to consider. If they represent something else entirely, then the question becomes even more unsettling. Why appear openly on highways? Why stand in clearings? Why allow eye contact before withdrawing? Why coordinate positions around human structures without breaching them? Across Australia, the pattern suggests something neither lost nor wandering. Something territorial. Something organized. Something that chooses when it is seen. And perhaps the most chilling conclusion is this: the encounters do not read like accidents. They read like controlled demonstrations. When isolated accounts are viewed individually, they can be dismissed. A tired driver on a highway. A ranger alone in the snow. A fisherman at dusk. A group of hikers startled by shadow and silence. But when 14 structured encounters across an entire continent begin to mirror one another in behavior, posture, coordination, and restraint, the dismissal becomes less comfortable. These reports do not describe chaotic beasts charging blindly from the bush. They describe presence. Deliberate positioning. Controlled visibility. Across rainforest, desert, alpine terrain, and farmland, the same elements repeat: upright stature, broad shoulders, low-hanging arms, deep resonant vocalizations, wood knocks, coordinated movement, perimeter pacing, direct eye contact, and calculated withdrawal. The consistency is what unsettles researchers the most. The creatures are not described as confused. They are not described as fleeing in panic. They do not behave like animals stumbling accidentally into human space. Instead, they appear at boundaries: campsites, roads, fence lines, rail corridors, cabins, places where human territory meets wilderness. They make themselves visible just long enough to be understood, then disappear without chaos. It suggests awareness of space. Awareness of structure. Awareness of us. Even more compelling is the restraint. In each account, the presence was powerful enough to dominate the situation physically. Witnesses consistently described immense size and strength. Yet escalation did not occur. No forced entry. No confirmed attack in these narratives. Only demonstration. Almost as if the objective was not harm, but reminder. A reminder that the wilderness is not empty simply because we choose to map it. A reminder that control over land does not automatically equal understanding of it. A reminder that something may be observing the observers. Skeptics will continue to attribute these sightings to misidentification or imagination. That is expected. Healthy skepticism protects reason. But skepticism does not erase recurring patterns. And patterns, especially across vast geographic distances, demand examination rather than dismissal. If these accounts represent an undiscovered species, then Australia's wilderness holds far more than officially recorded. If they represent something else, something older, more adaptive, more deliberate, then the implications are even deeper. Because what these 14 encounters share is not randomness. It is structure. It is positioning. It is timing. And above all, it is control. The most unsettling possibility is not that something large walks the forests, deserts, and mountains of Australia. It is that it chooses when to be seen. And if that is true, then every boundary between human territory and wilderness may not be as one-sided as we assume.